My talk will start neither in the shady areas or with the sweet water of the first presentation or in the Renaissance, but rather I'll begin in a palace. Well, not really a palace, the Emirates Palace Hotel in Abu Dhabi. As some of you may know, my previous university, NYU, has a campus in Abu Dhabi, and I'd been involved, and I was asked, of all things, by someone in the government to come over and be a talking head for the first live feed of an opera in the Arab world. So they put me up in this 7-star hotel called Emirates Palace with an enormous lobby that was flanked on all sides by people, young people whose only job, it seemed, was to cater to any need I might have. And as I crossed this lobby, honestly in search of the caviar bar, which I never found, someone intercepted me and said, "Oh, Professor Beckerman." I had no idea how they knew who I was. "Wouldn't you be interested in the music and neurology conference taking place in this room?" So suddenly I was ushered into the music and neurology conference run by the Cleveland Clinic. And it was all about the use of music and sound in stroke recovery. As you know, in many cases, when people have strokes, they lose the ability to speak, sometimes at all, but sometimes in any way resembling their previous ability. Well, it turns out that the way the brain works and in relation to sounds, that often, even if you can't speak, you can sing. And so the Cleveland Clinic and others had developed a therapy which involved learning how to sing. So if you couldn't say, "My name is Mike," you could probably go, "My name is Mike." And so it was a series of therapies that allowed people over a period of weeks and sometimes months, often involving tapping, like, "My name is Mike," and then more like, "My name is Mike," and finally, "My name is Mike," where they would actually, in their brains, think they were singing, but would actually be sounding like speech to anyone who was there. So that's one of the ways, of course, that music or sound and science interact. I'll be talking about 5 of them, and then, as promised, 2 ways why, in a sense, music can make you glad to be alive. The second thing I'll talk about is Parkinson's disease, something my grandfather had. And it's been studied that there are all kinds of rhythmic auditory stimulation, because one of the problems in Parkinsonism is bradykinesia and festination, that one can't move. And of course, some people who are suffering from Parkinson's can move if somebody pushes them a little bit, but it's been discovered that the use of sound and music and rhythmic stimulation can allow people who previously weren't able to move to have some kind of a normal sense of gait and motion. And it's also been found that there's something called Parkinson's song, which uses singing to stimulate vocal cords and also allow people with Parkinsonism to move in ways they couldn't before. Now, I guess since it's science, we'll do a little experiment. So could we have some writing on the screen? So, would you mind playing the music? So, was there anyone who absolutely was incapable of reading that text because something was playing? There are some people who claim that they can't, but usually people can do perfectly well. Well, now I'm going to ask you to do something else. This is a piece by Bach, originally for 2 harpsichords, featuring this recording, featuring the wonderful Russian pianist Sviatoslav Richter, and it's a fugue, right? It has a series of voices coming in. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to listen again to this, but I want you to read it, but while listening to the voices of the fugue as they come in. And don't take your ear off those voices. Once again. Thank you. Well, if you're like me, you can't read while your ear is following music closely. You become almost momentarily aphasic. It's just impossible. And the only way to read is to actually, as it were, metaphorically, take your ear off the music to do that. So in thinking about this, I also began to have an interest in certain psychological states. My research field is, of all things, Czech music, and one of the composers I've worked on was Dvorak, known for the New World Symphony and considered by the Czechs to be the healthy composer. Smetana, who was his predecessor, died of syphilis, so Dvorak was the healthy composer. And yet Dvorak suffered, as I gradually realized, from agoraphobia and panic attacks. Well, I got interested in those things, and it seemed that a lot of so-called mental health issues were related to obsession. Whether they actually had obsession in the diagnostic title, like OCD, or whether, like PTSD, you couldn't stop something from repeating, or catastrophic thinking, where you thought that inevitably the little pimple on your hand was terminal cancer. Those were the kinds of things that you were tormented by an obsession. And even Dvorak's agoraphobia and panic disorder was a fear, an obsessive fear that when you left the house, something bad was going to happen, that you were going to lose control. So using these kinds of mental, even physiological limits of what the brain is capable of, it seemed to me that some of the places where one's obsession would take place were not the place where you followed music. And therefore, not simply listening to music, that might not have any effect, because as you noted, listening to music while reading is no problem. It's when you focus on the musical activity. So I had in mind a series of musical therapies that would be based on a certain kind of listening, with the idea that it would at least temporarily disable these kinds of obsessive thoughts that you couldn't stop, that it would actually stop these obsessions. Another place that music has played a profound role is with dementia and Alzheimer's. My mother was suffering with what some call mid-stage Alzheimer's. She could sometimes know who she was speaking to, but other times not. She had been an actress, had a lot of poise, so she could, I won't say fake it, but she would look at people and say, "What's your life like?" And they would say, "What do you mean dementia?" She doesn't have, but of course she was suffering from dementia, and there were many things she couldn't remember, short-term memory. But I was with her in the car once, and I mentioned a play my brother had been in 1959 with somebody named Leni Kazan, if you remember that actress. And the play was called Dark of the Moon. And I just said the words Dark of the Moon, and my mother burst into song, No, Never Alone. Well, there was this song, No, Never Alone, that had been part of that play, which she remembered perfectly well, word for word. And it's been shown that there are many kinds of therapies that can really affect people suffering from dementia. There was a wonderful documentary called Alive Inside. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see it, but it's actually where headphones were put on people who were thought to have almost no ability to communicate, but the headphones played music from those people's youth. The music, they did research and found out what were the favorite pieces of grandmothers or whoever, grandfathers, and they put headphones on them, and it was a little bit like Oliver Sacks's Awakenings, if you've seen that, where these people who were thought to be locked in suddenly, through the power of sound, regained some aspect of what seemed to be their humanity. So these kinds of therapies are ongoing. There's one more thing which is a personal fantasy. I hope you'll indulge me. Music therapy is sometimes a bit like social work with music. But I imagine a kind of directed musical therapy. Now again, it's my fantasy, so forgive me, but where a therapist with a real knowledge, unlike myself, of psychotherapy, but also a wide knowledge of music, would treat patients, at least in part, by prescribing them certain pieces or certain collections of pieces to listen to, on the basis that these pieces of music aren't simply sort of entertainment patterns. And while it pains me to even slightly disagree with the first brilliant presentation about emotion and art, to me, and I think people would agree, even the first presenter, art is filled with ideas. Music is not just emotions. Music's filled with ideas. As a matter of fact, it's the synthesis of all these things that give it its extraordinary power. And that these things together, either in a collection of pieces, and it wouldn't have to be classical music. It could be the famous motet by the Renaissance composer Guillaume Dufay. Why do I pick that? Because the previous speaker showed a picture of Brunelleschi's Dome. And famously, the contemporary composer, Dufay, wrote a motet called Nuper Rosarum Flores, which is based on a musical equivalent of the measurements of Brunelleschi's Dome. So music, of course, is also very much about ideas. Well, we believe, of course, in the power of medicine to return people to health and to keep them alive. Well, it may seem cheap to ask, but why keep people alive? And my answer, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, is so they can listen to music. That I suppose at one point I just sort of turned it into a shorthand, which is human beings invented music when they decided finally that they were unable to fly. Because music is something that can give you a sense of, among the many things it does, a sense of weightlessness, a sense of floating like nothing else. Music is also, of course, the most living record of a lot of the past that we have. Sure, motion pictures come along, but we all know how photography and motion pictures, purporting to show the truth, are also distortions of a kind. But we have musical sound recorded for 1,000 years that tells us an enormous amount. And the experience of music that gives one, again, this combined sense of what we call the emotional. And again, I'm fascinated. I'd love to hear from people what they think emotions are, because there are those people who think emotions are things you can actually quantify by looking at the brains. So an emotion is a scientific thing. And there are other people who think, well, emotion's just a word we use as a placeholder for things that we can't really describe because they're not cognitive anyway. But again, most of us are not like Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk, who think that our reality as human beings can be divided into thought and emotion, we think that somehow these things fuse together in various ways that we're really not very clear about or able to articulate well. But that this happens in music, not only in music, but it happens when you combine music with visual images. Because let's just take a film, or take your favorite film that you can imagine. It's not simply A plus B equals A plus B, right? You have sound and you have image, but when you put them together, you get something that neither has. You get something new. One of my favorite things to look at, as trite as it might seem, I don't know if you've ever seen on YouTube or something, the contests they have when people choreograph music to model planes, and they have these competitions. So, you know, if you have ba-da-dum-bum, bum-bum, bum-bum, nice piece, and when you have a plane going like this, very nice. But when you get ba-da-da-da, you know, you get a visceral sensation that comes out of neither of those alone. And that's also a kind of metaphor for the way music fuses with the rest of our realities to create something powerful. So music, of course, is one reason to stay alive and be alive, but there's one more, and forgive the musicologist academic in me, shoot me at the end. Thinking about music and sound itself is so exciting, because after all these years, from the Renaissance on, we don't really understand music. You know, sometimes I think it was brought here by aliens. Just what is it? How does it work? How does it combine with the rest? Why does it become so powerful? We talk about connections between music and mathematics. The large body of a population who can't respond to a mathematical equation can respond to this musical sound. Thinking about music in the past. How do we access the past? Well, if we take this moment, some background sound, our own mental processes, our awareness of everyone else in the room, all these things are gone. The moment we don't have room on our floppy disks to hold that kind of information. So how do we access the past? How do we talk about the past? How do we think about the sounds of the past? Do we simply impose our own aesthetic on, say, Baroque music? Or do we try as hard as we can to get Baroque ears? Can we recapture any part of the past even a moment ago? Or as I thought in my Dvorak research, if I can't find the keys that I put in my pocket 5 minutes ago, how do I know what Dvorak was thinking in 1893? You know, how do we do that? And again, I think thinking about music, because it's so difficult to kind of figure out what it is, really makes it clear to us how difficult everything is, how hard it is to understand anything, how tricky it is to really feel you know something. And even if after all this time you actually think you know it, then how do you convey that knowledge to people? And then, of course, the snarky side is, how do you convey that to people who aren't buying your argument? How do you convey things that you know? So taken together, we understand the connection between music and science and all the wonderful things that music can do as it interacts with science. But we also understand that all of these things kind of can create a world where we're able to experience music and ask questions about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Beckerman. Before you go, does anybody in the audience happen to have any questions for the dean? Any questions on the talk? Oh, I got some over here. Okay.
Good.
So there are several of applications and companies trying to use music as therapies. What do you think about it? Are they effective, or this is still, the science is not there to find the music that a specific person needs in order to help them in the recovery process?
Well, I mean, I should know more about those companies, and I'd be very interested in learning more. Now, sometimes to a fault, honestly, my profession is based on a kind of core skepticism. Even in things like music and neurology, where there were some very good labs at NYU where I was, and they would, give their speeches about it, and then I would ask them 2 questions, and they would sort of giggle and say, yeah, well, we don't know that. We can tell you maybe what happens when you go from C to E, but we can't tell you what happens in that Bach fugue at all. And so I think it's certainly possible. I would be skeptical of claims. I mean, this is one thing I've talked about with my wife, who's been a scientist and a practitioner, is what's called evidence-based medicine. And that's sort of at the core of everything, except there's a wonderful article which I would recommend to all of you, which is a satire on evidence-based medicine. It's about the efficacy of parachutes in treating gravitational challenges. And the problem is they can't find any randomized trials, so therefore parachutes don't really work. So I think we have to be careful of that kind of science that insists on a knowledge that really could sometimes be pulled apart a bit. But thank you for your question.
Another question?
Have you done any, this is a good presentation, thank you very much. Have you done any research with hard of hearing or deaf population?
I haven't personally. I've studied that, and I think there are distinctions between sort of what you're calling hard of hearing and deaf populations, and I know that sort of what we'd call musical responses of deaf populations fall into 2 broad categories. One is vibrational, where you can either grab an instrument or a drum and then have, and the other is gestural, where gestures replicate something like music in the minds of these people. Now there are some famous deaf musicians who have taught themselves to play, and that's sort of maybe a kind of special case, but in deaf communities, again, there is the vibrational, and there's a lot of possibility in that, and a lot of kinds of interesting sensations of rhythm that people had not really thought about in the past. And then again, you have the kind of physical and gestural approximations of music in that community. Thank you.
Any other questions? One more in the back.
Thank you. That was just fascinating. I was struck by the anecdote about dementia patients and having them, or I don't actually, it may not have been the dementia patients, the patients that had. I believe you said were sort of, for all intents and purposes, didn't seem to be sort of there anymore, and then looking at their response to listening to music that they liked when they were young. I'm curious to hear more about that, and just when we think about it, and you sort of touched on this, music is kind of the only thing that lasts forever, right? I mean, you can hear something that was written 1,000 years ago and relive it, and it doesn't decay in some way, right? But I've also heard that from the kind of the human cognition and memory standpoint, the sense of smell really plays like one of the most important roles. I'm just wondering if you've explored that a little bit, and how the sense of sound and how that relates to memory, and how to, if you have any more sort of
that's fascinating
on that.
About odor and smell. I just had a sort of tongue-in-cheek notion when you said that of, you have these people who haven't been able to respond to anything. If you gave them musical sound and odor at the same time, it might kill them entirely. But no, that's fascinating. And the other thing is, again, taken with a grain of salt, music actually penetrates the body in a way that smell also penetrates the body. And there probably is an art form waiting to be made that already somebody's experimented with, of combining the two in a kind of in an artistic way. But I think that film was very, very good. Of course, I assumed, right, that in order to make the film, and they had like 7 or 8 people showing what happened to them when they put their headphones in. I guess just the skeptic in me assumes there must have been 20 others that nothing happened, and in the film they show you what the things that happened. So, I haven't been directly involved in that kind of research, but I think it looked interesting and exciting, and certainly, and then it creates problems. Well, okay, so you bring somebody back for 20 minutes, then what? So, I mean, I'm accustomed to, in questions around the arts and sound, that, if the bear ever gets over the mountain, there's always another mountain. And any puzzle solved simply yields another 24 puzzles that are equally difficult.
I'm coming to this lecture as a musician, but also as a molecular biologist. And so I'm really curious about, my kind of more general question, like how would the two departments collaborate? But also if you think it's possible to create like a cellular effect by treating like a culture dish with a specific frequency, for instance, or a piece of music.
Well, that would be fascinating. Well, in the past we would have been anxious to collaborate with your departments, but since you've lost all your funding, we're not interested in No, I think there are a lot of fruitful collaborations that are possible. I mean, I was just talking about it, not even in preparation for this talk, but just in general with my colleagues, who work in areas around disability, but also in questions of neurology. We had somebody teaching music in the mind in the department. I think there could be extremely wonderful synergies between these departments, even along the lines that Nir suggested, which is getting people with backgrounds in the arts and the sciences together to talk about these issues. But thank you. Look forward to it. Deans are easy to find. So thank you, everyone.